We'll do it live.
Put it in the chat, Greg. Is this your
cannot
first time?
Yes. What happens now?
Well, now, like, we're a minute early, so we're just kicking off. For anybody watching, this is a shit show, but we'll get there. Anytime without Silas, it's a shit show. So just accept
behind
that.
the scenes footage, never before seen, except for last week when we screwed up as well.
We also fucked this up, yeah.
Is anyone on the Twitch chat thing?
I think there's one person, and it's Ryan Narain calling us amateurs.
Oh yeah. Well, he's the amateur.
Yeah. All right, we're at 11, so we can officially kick off. And I could, of course, do that, but I talk enough as it is. So I think our master of ceremony should do this.
Hello, and welcome to another Glasshouse session. We are continuing our weekly sessions during the Ukraine conflict, maybe beyond. This week, we have a few things to discuss. Viasat came out and finally told us what happened, and it was misconfigured VPN device, which, you know, $10 to everyone who bet on that one. There was a report by some Juan Andres Guerrero Saad person who I think he linked a wiper to the attack. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to read that blog post, but we'll see if we can get some info on that. The GCHQ guy spoke in Australia saying that, like, seriously, there is a cyber war. Please stop saying there isn't. It's happening. And there's been more InfoWar type stuff. So with that, I'd actually like to hear more about this wiper from Jags.
All right, so yeah, I guess it's sort of fair that we kind of kick off there. And to be honest, it sort of took over the past like 36 hours of my life, so it just kind of feels like a continuation. But I mean, shout out to Max, Vanar Marongan, and Tom, and everybody who worked on this with me. We got incredibly lucky, right? Like, I think there's a lot of speculation about, you know, there've been folks asking. We tried to be as clear about it on the blog without looking like idiots, but this was VT dorking at its finest, right? Like, you tell me that there's been some kind of modem hack and that there's an IR ongoing, and you just hope someone, you know, fucked up. And I, just to be fair, I don't think that it was the IR people who did, but somebody from Italy just put the binary on VT, and I'm incredibly grateful that they did. I am really grateful that they did, because Mandiant is an unbelievable, you know, analysis powerhouse, but they are right now trapped under the typical, you know, weaponized NDA situation, and Viasat is making their statements, and I don't think that they're they don't have like bad intentions, but I don't know that they're expressing things as completely as they could be, or as soundly as they could be. And, you know, Dave and I were talking about this before the call started. I'm not going to tilt at that windmill. Like, I appreciate that they didn't, you know, try to sue us into silence or just deny it. So this is a win for me. Like, I'm happy.
Okay. I just feel like I should unspin your spin just very briefly and put it a little bit into context.
Yes, please.
And so the question is, did someone execute a wiper on all of these Linuxy modems or not? And the answer is yes. Yes, they did. Yes, that's what happened. And here's the wiper, and it wipes things. And it's potentially connected to another wiper, maybe, very tenuously.
Very tenuously.
Like a thin thread. Fine.
Thin strand.
That's important to know, right? So like, that is not conveyed by public statements from Viasat. And I just want to take it to the larger point. You absolutely cannot trust what companies say about incidents publicly. this is Okta, this is Viasat, this is everybody, right? And so where does this ride into cyber policy? Well, so much of cyber policy is based on news reporting that comes from the public statements of companies.
Wait,
And is
Dave,
hence wrong.
I got to hop in on this because
Okay.
I'm going to stir the pot just like this much.
Okay.
Right. So there's a proposal out there from the US government. I believe it's the FTC mandating that companies that are identified as critical infrastructure report to the government when they're breached.
I thought that passed in the last fiscal, whatever you call it.
Yeah, that was the 24-hour reporting thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's out.
Like-
That's in the
Okay, so-
season now.
So here's my question. Where's the CISA reporting on the Viasat?
I don't believe this is an American company, right? Oh, actually, it is an American
It
company.
is an American, but
It is.
no. So here's where the CISA bit gets complicated, because I'm pretty certain that public discussions with companies have been had, but they've been about classified materials. So how do you handle CISA in the middle of all that, right? Because it's not NCSE, right? NCSE could sit down and have an equities conversation and go, hey, this is the part that's relevant. Stop over classifying the shit out of this. We're going to go talk to the public and set the record straight. But I don't know that CISA can do that. I mean, CISA's in a very awkward spot with that stuff.
Didn't CISA even delete, like they had that live call-in thing, and then they deleted the YouTube video on it?
That's a different deal, but
Like-
yeah.
Like, I don't know, man.
We have to resist the urge to turn this into a CISA linchpin call.
And another thing.
Well, I think the CISA thing is a separate. There's two threads here, right? One, you absolutely can't believe what companies say in general, right? And we see this over and over again, and we don't remember it for some reason. And two, it affects our larger strategic understandings. So one of the things you have to counteract for when you're doing public policy work is that all the papers you read are based on bad data, because you're getting lied to.
I think the way to think about this is that essentially it's trying to like legislate what happens with social media, relying exclusively on what Facebook reports publicly. Like
Right.
That's basically where we're at. It's like trying to figure out what's going on based on the companies who have a vested interest are saying is going on, and it's fundamentally flawed.
Well, it's not just the companies. I mean, look, I harken back to a talk I gave at CMU in 2017, and I think Dave, you watched this, you commented on it heavily, but like we've always had a validation crisis in the threat intel space. We continue to have a validation crisis, and like that's a discussion we continue to have, which is okay. All of the private sector, including the threat intel companies, but slightly differently, have marketing and all kinds of, perverse incentives, dark patterns, as Haroon brilliantly put it in his call with Ryan, who's in the chat. And obviously they're not motivated to report things the way they should be. The threat intel companies in some cases can't, even when they know better, right? Like even for us, like you have to sit down and be like, well, of course I'd love to take a curtain call on this one, but if I get sued by Viasat, how cool are you guys? You know what I mean? Like that's a discussion that you have to have, and some people don't have the stomach for it. Some companies just choose not to talk at all, as basically any threat intel FANG doesn't. And then we skip over the academics because we've realized that like most of the academic sector is useless. And I say this being, partially an academic.
It's the nicest way of putting it as well, by the way.
Well,
That was a very polite way of saying that.
I was forced to remove the word armchair from the first paragraph of that acid rain report, and you'll know exactly where it was supposed to go. Okay, so we skip over the academic sector, who really should be the ones that come give us some kind of independent view in the middle of things. And now we're looking at government and being like, well, in the absence of anybody else, like, are you guys going to give us the skinny? And in some cases, you do, right? Like you see, it's such few examples, but like the Swiss with Cert Melanie, when they did that RUAG report on Turla, I'm sure a defense contractor, RUAG, did not want to come out and say, look, this is all the ways we got owned for 2 years, but they did. And then obviously NCSE just fucking kills it every time they open their mouths. You can actually take their work and take it to the bank and their YAR rules work and their indicators are right and their samples are available. Like, you can trust that. But within the US government, we don't have that. And I mean, yeah, we could throw that at CISA. We could also just say, is CISA equivalent to the NCA in the UK? And we're still missing a player that should spin out of NSA that is more competent.
So I think like you hit on one of the things that like it kind of bothers me is that basically all of the public cyber threat intelligence is marketing. Like the only stuff that we ever get access to is stuff that has been through marketing and has been released for purposes of like big upping the company that releases it. Now, there are exceptions. JAGS, for example, is probably not, purely marketing, but there's an element of that. However, let's.
I'm the only not marketing part of it. No, I mean, and don't. I have my bent on what I put out, but it's marketing. It's definitely marketing, right? Like I appreciate that SentinelOne is willing to invest into us building our brand this way, and that they give me the independence to have a team that isn't fucked with, but it's still marketing, right? And you got to call it what it is, right? Like if I, it is what it is.
So here's my question, right? And I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too far, right? So I get it. It's marketing, right? Because these are commercial companies. They've got a product to sell. They've got shareholders, et cetera, et cetera. At what point does it become no longer, hey, this is a sales gimmick and it's now a public safety bid, right? Number one. Number two, where's the break for, hey, listen, I understand that this is bad for your stock. However, it's the greater good for you to be truthful and honest about your breach. And number three, I get it. Look, CISA's understaffed, right? They've got a huge mission. Where is the movement from the US government to get them up to speed? They've been around for a decade. They should be far more mature. There should be better coordination, right? Listen, I spent more than 2 decades in government. I've got very good friends that work at CISA, but what I'm seeing still is kind of like this food fight amongst the US government over, who owns which part. And it has to do with funding and nothing to do with mission. So that's a whole other rabbit hole. I don't know that I necessarily want to go down. I'm just going to point out that there's a problem when the making of the money interferes with public safety.
Well, and you have two problems there, right? Because you hit on a point with CISA. I am far from the expert when it comes to how the USG actually works, but there's some fucking friction between the mandate and all these people that want to pile on, want to take bits, want to own things the way that you get in US government all the time, right? We own this bit, fuck off. And are incredibly not capable of doing it. And that doesn't seem to be a problem. And then there's the money, but like CISA's budget just got ballooned further. And I'm not saying that they need more money or they don't need more money. I'm just saying I'm not sure that the whole thing is money, right? Like you have had a great deal of money. And right now we're still looking at you being like, look, we love you guys. It's great to see the talks and the posts and, there's strides being made. They've been kind enough to feature my work. I am fond of CISA, the people that I know at CISA. I'm just saying when it comes to evaluating how much we can be like, oh, thank God CISA's here, right? Like, that I think that aspect is still deficient.
So go ahead, Bob. Sorry.
Yeah. So the money argument is kind of a silly argument to have, right? Could they use more money? Yes, they could always use more money, right? There are bigger problems DOD has thrown gobs of money at this, gobs of money, and it hasn't solved anything. Why? Because they can't do talent management or authorities in US government. And the reason they can't do talent management or government or authorities is because all of that, the authorities and the mission is tied to how much funding I get, whether it gets used for the mission or not, right? Like it was hilarious watching Keith Alexander when he was dual-hatted as director of NSA and Cyber Command, because when he went to go talk about what great things were being done, it was always NSA, NSA, NSA. When he went to Congress to go ask for money, it was always cybercom, 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 right? So the money argument is to me, it's immaterial. My question is, when is the US government really going to get on board and figure out that this is a mission, right? And pin the rose on somebody and actually give them the authorities to operate? I just don't.
It's funny that you bring up Cyber Command, because I will say, and we used to, and some folks still shit on Cyber Command quite a bit. I know the grug is biting his tongue as it is, but I will say cooperating and talking to some of the folks at Cyber Command and talking to some of the folks at like CNMF in particular, like you see a different mission and you see a different, you see there's a very different discussion when someone competent can sit there and say, oh, cool, thank you for sharing this. I think this, that, and the other. And let me go talk to these folks who have an authority where they can do this, that, and the third. And that's a very different conversation than anyone. Like, if you go talk to CISA, they're like, let me figure out what this is. And they don't necessarily come back. But the worst part is you go talk to FBI, NSA, whomever, and they're just like, thank you. And they shut the door. And you're like, well, I'm so glad that I spent this time like bringing you this information. It's just,
the different groups and the different agencies, no argument have, different personalities that go with them, right? The Cyber National Mission Force, those folks are primarily DoD, right? They've got a very different mindset than, the Department of Homeland Security and FBI. Like, I get that, but that's also part of the problem, right? It should be hey, listen, I work for the US government. This is the mission. Let's go do the mission, regardless of who's got the authorities. I mean, in the CNMF, I'll give credit's due. CNMF does some of this, right? But, when we said that, hey, the Coast Guard is going to do counter narcotics missions, they went, well, we've only got so many cutters, nothing can go out on the blue ocean. They went, great, here's what we're going to do. We're going to stick a token Coast Guard guy on a Navy destroyer or cruiser, and we're now going to reflag you as a Coast Guard asset. You're going to go do things under their authorities. Like, how hard is that to do that in this space, right? And then let me add to that, how hard is it to add the intelligence people in there, right? So that we can get reports out on a timely basis. And I'm going to hand wave the whole equities thing because Dave and I will get into a knife fight on it, right? But this shouldn't be that hard.
Well, what about involving the private sector in that sense, right? Like, and that's where the other end of this comes, right? We know competency is going to come from one of two places. Private sector people are going to take the time to train other people in schools and government or whatever, or very specific government people who actually know their shit and they're very, rare and their time is very taken up and they're in very specific spaces, will take the time to train other people, because that's it. Like, people aren't going to grow from, sometimes in the hacker community, we do get folks that just spring from the ground and life finds a way and they develop a blog and they have a Twitter and they get hired, right? But that isn't a talent pipeline. That isn't 8,200 training, 20,000 proteges and they all go into the private industry afterwards. You're like, wow, what an abundance of talent. Like, we don't have that. So it isn't just gives us some more money. It isn't even just let that money percolate to Booz Allen. Like, we're missing something, and it isn't just the talent pool, it's the talent pipeline.
Well, we're missing all sorts of things, right? So let me start out by saying that, the private sector is not a monolithic, homogeneous group, right? The private sector, when I work in production, right, of a widget, is very different than the private sector when I work at, Mandiant or Sentinel Labs, where my business is selling these things. So, the private sector equivalent in the cyber threat intelligence, equivalent of the equities is, do we release this now or do we use it for marketing and wait a little while, right? I mean, I think the first one that kind of took us down this road was really the Mandiant, APT-1 report, right? Like, they had that for a long time, right? And again, I'm not saying good, bad, or otherwise, but the way it worked was they had that for a long time and they made a big, PR spectacle out of it, right? And they made a lot of money. But again, that's kind of the, the private sector equivalent of that. The other thing is we have got to get away from the fact that, everybody that's going to work in the cybers needs to be a Jags or a Gruck or a Dave Itel, right? Not everybody needs to be a brain surgeon, right? We need people that can be just good field medics that, hey, listen, they're not going to cure the patient, but they're going to stabilize them so they make it to the hospital, right? So we've got to stop talking like, everybody needs, 8,200 level knowledge, because they don't, right? I'll take a kid out of high school that's interested and has a lab in his garage, and it's not that hard to make him a really good SOC operator. And yeah, then eventually he grows up, maybe he gets to be JAG someday, but it is not one
I
pipeline.
want to be tagged.
It is.
Yeah, I don't know that you should really put that on that kid.
Grow up in JAGs. I realize should not be in the same sentence. But it's not one pipeline. It's many pipelines, right? Because there's lots of things that we need.
But just completely on a tangent with like some of the things that you mentioned, basically about how the commercial space treats, it doesn't necessarily have the same equities discussions as like the government, but they do have their own point of view. I want to bring up Lapsus, which I think is it's doing a huge amount of like super awesome stuff with, I want to say no talent, but not necessarily the technical skill set that one would expect from a high-level APT. However, they are like just doing amazing stuff with like paying people money for installing like remote desktop software, like shit that just works. And they're not getting coverage for it because none of that shit is covered by XDR pamphlets. Like none of that's in the brochure. No one says, if you buy our stuff, no one's going to take $20,000 and install software. Like no one has that. So it's just not being discussed all that much. And I think that kind of plays into it a bit as well. Like we focus on things that are solvable with the technology that is being sold right now. It's solvable in theory anyway.
Well, so as far as Lapsus goes, we kept talking about technical debt collectors, and with ransomware, right? And I think that was a really fitting analogy. And it almost puts the ransomware epidemic in a good light in the sense of saying, like, look at the immune system, the global immune system, pointing out just how weak the whole situation actually is. But it turns out that it can be worse, right? And like that you don't even that the ransomware dudes were trying too hard. And it wasn't showing you just how bad your immune system actually is. It really can be some fucking 17-year-old with like, just a charming phone voice and some remote management software, and it's a fucking shit show. Like it's unbelievable because of how terrible, like the fact that people call it a ransomware gang, like they're not even deploying ransomware. They're not even going to bother going that far. They're showing that you can be extorted on the basis of the data alone and that you're fucked any which way you look at it.
Point that I've been making for a long fucking time, that like ransomware is not about the fucking ransomware. But I think it's brilliant. And I think in a way, if you look at it, you can kind of look at the access brokers as being like, they're a cheap option. If you want to go for like the premium level access broker, you don't need to find the misconfigured VPN or like the RDP with, credential stuffing attacks that work against it. You can say, instead of paying $5,000 for access, you could just pay $20,000 for access and go straight to someone who works there, right? Then you can get access to anything. You don't need to do this, scanning for stuff. And if your payout is more than $20,000, you win. And, it's bound to be eventually. So I don't know.
Brazil was always a good case of that. Like Fabio Assolini, great researcher, very, very focused on his native Brazil. I think he's always been kind of screaming about the tactics in Brazil that are just working so well. And we're all like, well, fuck it, that's Brazil, who cares? But like, this guy's been at it for years, and it must be at least 6-7 years ago that I think he did a VB talk where he's just like, guys, someone is paying operators at the ISPs to redirect all of the traffic to these 3 banks to one like attacker server for an hour, and they're paying them like $2,000, and you're literally credential phishing every person in a whole swath of the country for 1 hour. Like, that's where we start to have real discussions about the insider threat, right? It's not the like pretty white collar crime side of it. It's the how mundane it is to have one of your SOC guys, one of your low level technicians say, $2,000, yeah, I'll flip this thing for an hour and pretend that, you know, everything went wrong. And what do you do with it?
Misconfigured.
My bad, right?
Yeah, but I mean, the whole thing is actually really fascinating in a way, because it reveals that like there's people who've been talking about like the insider threat is, you know, like what if someone pays one of your employees, and everyone's like, oh yeah, that's a thing that we need to worry about. You know, I'll put that in the like, you know, aliens attack and or, you know, someone pays one of our insiders. And then it's like, oh yeah, so it turns out that like someone at like T-Mobile or wherever it was is just getting paid to do SIM swapping attacks because it's easy for them to make $5,000 to like, you know, set up one of these like Lapsus guys with like someone else's phone number than it is to work for a few months to make that much money. And this should make sense, because
let's take a minute to appreciate what's being said in the chat, which is that once again, we're giving them too much credit. Like we're still trying to elevate Lapsus to a conspiracy mastermind. Most of these attacks were done with like credentials stolen by malware and resold. So let's stop trying to elevate Lapsus to anything worth giving credit.
For 15 minutes about that.
Well, I mean, there's other things to talk about, right? Like we can talk about all kinds of.
Let's talk about SAPPAL, a completely made up group that might or might.
I'm saying like that you have to see them for what they are. That's the point. That is what they represent. Yeah. They are the absolute shittiest, weakest, saddest version of things, and they're fucking killing it. It's literally a child. It's a child. Right?
Like,
well, I think one thing that's changed.
So dumb, we can't even imagine how dumb it is. Like we still think of smarter things than they actually do. That's like how low level it is, right? We're still like, they must be doing this. No, they're not. Like they're going on a forum and paying $5 for like a list of like known passwords, and then they're just trying all of them, and it works. Like,
and I think something has changed though, right? Like, so like 10 years ago, you could not download an entire company's worth of information in 5 minutes. And as bandwidth gets cheaper, that changes, right? Because companies generate the same amount of data over time. The last year of my data is like 60 gig, right? Like that's it. Now 60 gig 5 years ago was hard to download. 60 gig now is like easy.
Yeah, well, 10 years ago, 60 gig was like an investment in disk space. Yeah. Now it's like scratch space where you're like, oh, I forgot to empty my trash. Let me just get another like, yeah.
And this has been a pretty easy change.
We've had this conversation. No, I was going to say we've had this conversation when it comes to the ransomware dudes and like all the storage, right? Like if there's something slowing down ransomware right now, it's the lack of hard drives in Russia. So like you guys should be grateful. Right. But it is a discussion we've had about like how do you maximize the value of taking that stuff in bulk. And to Dave's point, if this is showing a weakness in like in the development of security products, is like where is that product, which in theory I guess should be a firewall, a SIM or whatever, that's telling you, hey, why are 60 gigs worth of stuff moving in this direction to a place we've never been connected to before? Like there's such obvious really simple inventory problems in security. Like
this is here's the problem though that like you slightly glossed over, which is that it can't just tell you about it. It has to fucking react to it and stop it. Because if it tells you about it, by the time you learn about it, it's already over.
Dude, I agree, but it's not even telling you. You know what? Like that alert isn't being missed. It doesn't exist. Completely. So like. We can get to the point of like, okay, once this is a reliable alert, like why didn't you just stop it? I agree, but it doesn't exist.
That vulnerability delta, but there is no delta.
So let's circle back to a point you made earlier, though, right? About about the workforce, right? So, you know, I always laugh when they talk about like that they can't find cybersecurity talent. Listen, you know, the number of devices on the internet outnumbered the number of people on the planet something like 5 or 6 years ago, right? And that's only getting greater. And then to your point earlier about the amount of bandwidth going through, that's only getting, we are never going to have enough cybersecurity people. And yet we're still dealing with companies where they're pulling terabytes of logs daily from corporate networks. And you go to the SOC and there's like 7 people. How the hell are 7 people supposed to read, you know, 60 terabytes of logs in 24 hours and not miss something? The tools are wrong. There are far too many false positives. There's not enough intelligence in there. And I'm not going to get into the latest, you know, SOAR buzzwords, XDR, blah, blah, blah. It's all the same crap.
You watch it now. Sorry.
Yeah. We're looking for a needle in a stack of needles. So even if we had a good signature that was reliable, it would just get lost in the other, you know, reliable signatures that we get because there's no intelligence there.
So one of the funny things was a thread on Twitter about like IOCs that came out of the Lapsus attack. And it was fucking brilliant because that thing's like Bing search for security tools. And it was like, if someone is using Bing, it should be an IOC because literally no one is like no one on your network is going to use Bing. That's someone with like the default.
It's what made the Microsoft hack credible, right? Like the fact that they knew Bing's maps existed was something that showed that they'd been in there, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm pretty sure no one else knew that shit was real. that you know, it's my half joke. It's like I didn't know that shit existed until they came out and said, "Well, we have the source code for it," and we're like, oh, "Okay, is it any good?"
First time anyone has seen it outside of Microsoft.
I agree with Pablo in the tools thing. I mean, one thing is not gonna make up for the other. Both of them are a big problem, but the tools are always the force multipliers. And we have like RSA. You're blessed if you don't have to go to that fucking horrendous sales space, but there's a bajillion companies all selling you the latest hotness, right? Like Tanium comes up with a new bullshit acronym and everyone's running to compensate for that marketing by saying, we also do the bullshit acronym. Like everyone's trying to chase after the same thing. And you have a problem there with security investment, and you have a problem with the acquisition graveyards, and that it's twofold, right? Like if I decide, look, I'm not going to chase all the marketing things. I'm going to create a company that actually solves this one very simple, but one very important problem in cybersecurity. Like, I'll use the example of Stairwell. And I have a vested interest in Stairwell and I love what they're doing. And Silas is there and my best friend, Mike Wiasek, is there. So like, I'll use the example of Stairwell. Stairwell comes and says, we're going to solve one really simple problem first, which is file inventory problem. I know every file that has ever been in this entire enterprise. I have a copy of it. I know where it was. I know when it stopped being there, and you can scan through it. One simple problem. Convincing investors that they should go into a new product category, that they should invest in a thing for which no one has set out budget, is in itself a fucking massive challenge. And then when you do solve it, and let's say that you're well-intentioned and you have the right engineers and you're going to build the right thing and that you nailed the problem, then the minute you get into the slightly successful but not super successful part, then your biggest problem is Google coming in, Microsoft coming in, whatever, and saying, hey, here's $600 million right now. You can just go home and cough. And we'll take your vision and we'll grow it. And in reality, it's like, oh yeah, we'll take your company and we'll fucking destroy it, right? Like there's, and it's true. I'm not saying that hyperbolically. Like, look at everything Google Cloud has acquired, and now tell me where it is. Look at something like Chronicle, which we, Silas, Mike, me, Brandon Levine, a lot of us worked in. Chris St. Myers, everybody sort of like was so excited for the promise of Chronicle, and then Google Cloud comes in and like fucking turns it into dust overnight, right? So.
Wait, so should Google Cloud buy Kaspersky?
Well, for
Is that what you're saying?
for your mission of destroying Kaspersky, which is apparently like the only thing you think about now is just killing Kaspersky, sure, that's a way to go about it.
Mostly, I just think about trolling you day in, day out. That is my mission.
You leave Kaspersky alone. I think Kaspersky has enough headaches.
Kaspersky did nothing wrong.
And no, just you don't want Kaspersky to go away. You don't want Kaspersky to go away. And
Tell me
that's
why.
really,
Tell me why.
well, the first thing is clearly I'm not alone because it's the easiest fucking moment to have put sanctions on Eugene or Kaspersky. And clearly people in the US government argued against it, which is interesting. You'd need to like check your own house on this one. The other side of it is, I'm sorry, look at the threat intel space. Who has visibility into Iran and all these other places and parts of Eastern Europe and competent talent and the motivation to actually publish that shit? Like you're talking about killing a swath of the research space and of the brain trust that isn't easily replaced by anybody. So what is the...
will not be hired by US companies as like a place for them to go because the US is just like that.
I mean, I love all those people. There is irreplaceable talent in that company. You are not going to replace Kostin or Igor Kuznetsov or a bunch of the people in there who are absolutely brilliant. And you're not going to replace the telemetry that Kaspersky has. So I'm not, you can have whatever arguments you want about it, but I do think we need to check ourselves on, is this something we actually want? The same way we should have that conversation about Mandiant getting bought by Google Cloud. Because that's the other side of it, right? You want to kill Kaspersky, Google Cloud is going to turn Mandiant into dust within 18 months.
Didn't that go through? Isn't
In
that a done
theory.
deal?
And I love my Mandiant friends, and I hope they made a shit ton of money on this. I just don't believe in Google or Google Cloud's ability to support a services business, because that entails valuing people. It entails supporting people. It entails understanding consulting hours. It entails knowing how to share information. It entails knowing how to protect inbound client info. Like there's so many aspects of this that Google Cloud has no fucking clue what to do with.
Well, like we were mentioning earlier, like TAG, right? Like they have huge amounts of information. They know fuck tons. It's really, really great. And they say basically nothing, right? And
we got that report on the North Korean thing last week.
Yeah, there's some exceptions, but they say basically nothing. And that's basically the best case scenario for Mandiant, is that it somehow ends up still existing and doing good stuff. But
I love that you think Mandiant is going to change Google's culture as opposed to Google changing Mandiant's. Like short of putting Kevin Mandia as SVP of Threat Intel for all of Google,
it's not going to happen. Like it's over. But I guess that's good for, say, CrowdStrike and Sentinel. Like the.
So I don't think it is. I'll be honest with you. I don't think it is. I won't speak for CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike is its own ship. But look, I really appreciate our company's approach to things that we don't do, which is we don't do them. So we would like to support and partner the people who do. So we partner with Mandiant and we partner with other MSSPs and IR companies. And you go, hey, and this is a very different philosophy to how I've dealt with CrowdStrike in the past. I don't own this space because I don't even operate in it. So let me support you and we'll work together. So for me, Mandiant, like the idea of Mandiant doing poorly is not one that warms my heart. I would like Mandiant to do really well. I would like Mandiant to do really well in whatever configuration. And if that entails Google Cloud, so be it. But like, I think as an industry, if we leave our independent company hats to the side, we do need to think about the health of the overall availability of services and competency. And if a company like Mandiant or CrowdStrike goes under tomorrow, we have a problem. It isn't just like, oh, hooray, the competition is dead. It's like, no, who the fuck is going to replace that? Where do the competent people come in? Can we rely on the new IR partner? Are they going to share the same quality of data? Is their analysis good? Do they have market penetration? it's not that simple. It's not just take one and replace it with the other. Like Mandiant is great. Would a replacement for Mandiant be as great?
Could you just hire Intrusion Truth? Maybe they should like do like a loft style like merger with a VC
Yeah.
firm
Yeah.
Oh, it's based in
Try that out.
Boston.
based in Boston. Yeah. We could try that out.
At Stoke.
Something. Yeah.
At Truth. Come
Yeah.
on.
Did you read the Kim Zetter article on Intrusion
Oh, it
Truth?
was excellent.
I have
Kim is
to
the
admit,
best.
I only read the free one because I can't figure out how to
You
pay
can't
for that
pay
website.
for Kim Setter's fucking newsletter.
Honestly,
bro?
I keep trying, and it like my combination of no scripting utilities kicks me out, and I'm not sure which one it is yet.
Read out your credit card number, and we'll all sign you up for
All right.
Kim Setter's
Just
Perfect.
throw it in the
newsletter.
chat and we'll get you
Throw it in
sorted
the
out.
chat.
All right.
No, it's amazing. I mean, I'm happy. I'll be honest. I don't know how long it's been. I think we're at a year out since Kim started her Substack, and I'll admit that I was skeptical because you think of like a newsletter or something as like kind of something that isn't necessarily going to grab adoption, but like she's been killing it. Like her reporting has been amazing.
She is one of the better reporters in the space, like easily in the top 3. I don't know who the other 2 are off the top of my head, but
You get much better reporting from that sort of thing than you do from the big newspapers.
Well, it's because she's not selling advertising space, right? You've paid for the subscription, but I mean, no argument. She's brilliant and she does really great work.
So Intrusion
there you
Truth.
go. And
Are they
today's
the truth?
today's sponsor, Kim Zetter.
And NordVPN.
So
Oh
Jack,
my
let me ask you this question. I'll actually ask it for the group. So does anybody else perceive that there's possibly a conflict of interest or a reason for concern when the pipes provider, Google in this case, buys a public, CTI source? Do you perceive that as a possible conflict of interest? Because I have concerns there.
I mean, it depends on are we talking about a conflict of interest in the most like human sense of the term, or are we talking about it in a someone should bring a legal action sense of the term, right? Because like those are 2 thresholds. Like someone developing an OS and selling a bundled in EDR/AV inside of that OS, definitely antitrusty. That's a little swath. Somebody giving a service,
Do you think it's overall healthy for the community? Because my concern is, right, so it's one thing to go, hey, listen, we own these networks, we need really smart people, there's a bunch of talent there, we're going to buy them. Part of me wonders, okay, so now are they still going to report to the public? Are they still going to do the services that they currently do? Or do they now just become either an internal only resource for Google, or do they get, does what they put out to the public now get filtered by Google? Right.
So I think it goes even beyond that, which is that a lot of the people, like, I don't know if anyone's aware of this, but whenever there's an incident, there's actually a large number of small private chats that get spun up with researchers from different companies who get together to work the problem. And that's just kind of like the way that things get solved in cybersecurity is you need to have like all of these people actually collaborating in real time without going through like layers of lawyers and stuff just to get things done and to actually address the problem. And I'm curious if the people who are at Mandiant who currently take part in those are going to still be able to take part in those once they go to Google, because as far as I know, Google people do not make up a large percentage of the population of those groups compared to the number of people who actually work at Google anyway. So
having gone through the exact same merger process that Mandiant is in theory about to go through, I can tell you that I lasted for about 2 months working the way that I used to at Chronicle before I was literally traveling to a conference and I had Google lawyers descend on me saying, we haven't reviewed your slides, you're not allowed to speak at this place. Which in itself lets you know that they didn't know what we were doing, because I've never prepared slides before arriving at a place in the first place. So, there was that. What I'm trying to say here is, look, I think there's a ton of questions, right? There's a ton of questions, and I'm being fairly candid. Maybe that'll bite me in the ass, but like, I can speak to Chronicle's experience getting absorbed. I think Chronicle getting absorbed and bought by Google Cloud only benefited one person, which is Stephen Gillette, and everybody else got fucked and left. 90% of the people, I'm guessing, who were at Chronicle are gone. And VT is back in Google. So clearly that was a failed experiment. And I think for anybody that had the hope that Google was finally going to take its considerable resources and spin them out for the good of the security community and for its own good to make some freaking money, that clearly didn't go. So now with Mandiant, you have a relatively successful business. Sure, it isn't a $1 trillion company, but it certainly isn't small potatoes. They have unbelievable market penetration because they're trusted, right? Like, the joke is, break glass, break glass in case of IR, and it's a check. It used to be to FireEye, now to Mandiant, right? Like, that's who you trust to do the IR. And that's my concern. My concern is just, I think Mandiant does a critical service and has a critical presence that we should not take for granted within the security space. I want them to be healthy and happy and to keep doing what they're doing. And moreover, I wish they had greater freedom than they do right now. Like, the reason I was able to break Acid Rain is because I'm sure of it. Mandiant is under NDA because I'm dead sure that they found it. If I fucking found it lying around, they have known about it. So it's a little unfair. Like, if I could give the credit to the Mandiant people without creating a legal hullabaloo for them, I would. But I mean,
okay, let me just back you up to the Acid Rain thing. How funny is it that it got uploaded to VT with the name like Ukrainian op, right? Like, is that not Cybercom just throwing it up there from some random Italian IP? Like, the first thing I thought of when I saw that in your report was like, okay, well, someone put it there for you to find, right? Like, otherwise it would have been named like A.out. You know what I'm saying?
I wish we lived in a world where Cyber Command or whomever is playing those sorts of like fucking mind games. I really, if you ask me, I think no. It's just, you're talking about 5D chess and we're barely at 2D, and like
we're losing at checkers. Okay.
Yeah, we're losing at checkers right now. And the idea, and this always happens, right? Like, where is, what if the Russians did this? And like, what if, like, we always get in, like, especially the Intel LARPs, they'll always like, well, what if the Russians wanted, back it up. With this, my personal belief is someone who works at the Italian management company that's supporting the transition of this company that Viasat bought and isn't currently managing themselves, went back home one day after they were doing their thing and thoughtlessly or thoughtfully wanted to see if there were some detections, and they threw it on VT. That's my belief. And I have a variety of reasons to think that, mostly from VT collection, but like, I really don't think this was 5D chess. And frankly, I mean, look at it. It's not like they put it on VT and 3 days later someone got the hash. It's just, it was sitting there. It was uploaded on the 15th. It's been more than 2 weeks.
The only 5D hash we know of was the shadow brokers, and it took several days for that to even catch on. Remember when they put all the stuff out publicly and no one paid any attention, and they started having to like hit on Reddit like, hey, this looks interesting. Anyone else think this is interesting?
Is anyone out there?
That's pretty cool, huh?
Yeah. I get so many VT notifications every day, and like, that's without talking about our internal telemetry, and that's without talking about people who reach out, and that's without talking about trust groups, and that's without talking about like things I care about, and like that. We're under constant DDoS. The idea that someone just kind of puts it up there and you just trip over it, like that might have been the case back in like the eyesight days when you had people like Brian Bartholomew, who's in the chat, like who knew how to like monitor the shit out of VT. Nowadays, it's just a barrage. Like, we're not at a lack of indicators. We're just overwhelmed by
with many bugs. All eyes are shallow, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look at how Flame 2 hid, right? Like we found the second version of Flame because of an error. And I say we, Silas and I, found the second version of Flame because they had hard coded, they had statically linked putty, and it threw its own debug flag that had the real compilation date in it. But what the Flame guys had done was just started backdating Flame to before the suicide module. So anybody who saw new Flame come up, it's like, oh, it's not new. It's from right before, this was discovered. And that was enough.
That's
Nobody noticed. Nobody
Whoever
noticed
thought
that it
of
was a
that's
new
a
version. It wasn't
genius.
even the same. Like it was different. But if it weren't for that one little bug, I think everybody else would have been like old news. And you move on. You don't have time. You don't have time for it. So yeah, pretty smart.
That's genius. Flame 2 is awesome.
Yeah. So
They should get promoted. Just saying.
I just wanted to mention was a thing that's come up. I don't know if we've touched on the Mandiant issue yet, but I just want to circle back to that before it gets lost. But we've mentioned a load of times that as a community, we can process almost one major security event at a time. Like we can handle almost a full SolarWinds, right? What happens when Mandiant gets taken off the field? Right? Like with like all hands on decks as it is, we can basically manage to process about one of these. If all of that talent goes away and starts doing something else, that's going to be.
It's inevitable that all these companies get moved into other companies that understand database programming and like large scale computation, because that's the majority of the expense of doing this work. It is not building the Windows agent. No one cares. That thing is commoditized, right? Like, and also, should we point out that like we still are not good at Linux? That's still funny to me, right? Like,
Wow.
What's even better is that people say like, oh yeah, these guys are operating on Linux to avoid the Windows agent where we have good. No, they're not. They just never went away. Like
yeah.
they've been on Linux the entire time. It's only that now that you've started to notice.
Right?
Like, are you catching up to them?
Look, I mean,
The thing about the talent is, right, the talent doesn't go away, right? So like Jack's pointed out, Mandiant gets bought out, they get assimilated into the Google machine. Some people are going to get, become Googlers, and some people are going to go, this is not for me, and they're going to punch out. And they're either going to go to another existing company, or there's going to be a time delay and a new player is going to emerge. And to some extent, that's really healthy, right? Because you're going to have some people at Mandiant that have, really good new radical ideas that couldn't get them pushed through at Mandiant. They're really not going to be able to get them pushed through at Google. And so they're going to go off and start a new company and be able to push these new ideas. So to some extent, that's healthy. What's not healthy is that there's going to be a time delay where these really talented people that were at Mandiant that now have left Google, right, have to go through the whole like seed funding startup thing and building something from scratch.
But those startups exist now, right? Like, there's Dragos, there's Paragy, there's Josh Steinman's thing.
Right. And they always exist. And it's a good and healthy thing for, for the community for that to happen. So it's not like, Google bought the company, the talent disappears. That doesn't happen, right? But there is a time delay with these startups as they get their feet under them, right? From the ground up, pull themselves up by the bootstraps, right? Because they don't have the type of resource you would have when you're at a big company.
But it's an opportunity to do it better. You know what I'm saying? Like,
absolutely. And that's what I'm saying. It's healthy. It's a good thing.
Well, so the IR space is ripe for disruption. Disruption is, Freudian slip. No, it is ripe for disruption in a lot of ways, right? Like you look at a shop like Digitrust, and you look at the models. If there was a reason Chronicle started out successfully, is it broke the Splunk pricing model. It said, hey, you're fucking tired of having totally unpredictable pricing where 1 month suddenly eats up your entire Splunk budget because you had more queries and you're using a product that is essentially disincentivizing its own use. Well, what if we just gave you flat pricing? And that's enough to break the whole thing. IR right now is still run in a consulting hour-based model, which makes it very high profit per incident, but it disencourages its use. It disencourages its consumption. It sometimes keeps entire IRs from being completed because a customer will say, I'm sorry, there's not another $100,000 for you to keep doing this work. And it makes the reporting threshold much higher. I'm not calling those fucking guys unless we're dead sure something is wrong. So yeah, there's a lot of ways that you could revolutionize the IR space just by coming in and saying, you know what, we're gonna better the tooling, say like Velexity, right? Like we're not sending you a fucking consultant unless we need to. There's an endpoint agent that's gonna collect all of the memory dumps whenever something goes remotely wrong, and we'll check them out here. And if something's really wrong, then we'll let you know. Like, I think those are ways where you see how like IR could definitely use like a next gen IR. Like,
I mean, well, luckily what we've learned is that endpoint agents are infallible and never killed by the intruder as the very first thing that they do. So
And
that's
people-
been a real good lesson learned.
Nor are they the point of intrusion.
Never.
And
Never.
I think clearly every CISO out there is going, you know what? If you could just throw me one more agent to drop on my boxes and tell me we're all secure, I'll be happy. You know, even 2 or 3 more. Just, you know, one for memory, one for disk, one for, you know, network stuff, one to mother the other 3 to like see if anything goes wrong with them.
Right. To be more serious, you know, one of the things I got out of that CISA call is that there's a huge collection of what you could call small budget shops that do critical infrastructure work that cannot afford CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, and other teams. And we have a vested interest in giving them endpoint agents and collecting the data, because a lot of times it is not about us protecting that particular team. It is about us getting the intel off that from a government perspective. So I think the long-term disruption is going to be CISA moving into that space because they have to. So that may be, you know, that's my prediction that I also want to work towards making true. So, because I like to be right about these things. And I love that it annoys Jags. That's a second thing that I think would make it amazing.
No. It doesn't annoy me. I just think it's too pie in the sky, right? Like, I think the idea, and you heard it in the same call that I did. I was actually on the live call before it was, you know, publicly distributed without authorization of the people involved in the call. You heard some comments like someone in Hicksville, nowhere, in a tiny company being like, Splunk is awful expensive. Are you motherfuckers planning on paying for the bill? And it's like, no. We're like, well, then stop asking us for shit, right? Like, we're a normal small, medium business. We can't afford Splunk. And that's perfectly understandable. They really shouldn't have to in some ways. That said, going from that to CISA's going to do IR for you, you're a million miles apart.
So let me, Dave, I hope you're right. I hope you're right. Let me tell you why I think you're not, though. The reason I think you're not is
end him.
We as Americans have a healthy distrust of our government. And no public company ever is going to willingly invite the US government to sit there and monitor their networks. It's not going to happen, right? Like,
can you imagine what it's going to be called, having an agent from the government running on all of your boxes?
right.
So
Which was Dave's other proposal. Dave was proposing this shit 6 months ago. What if we had an agent from CISA? What if we had Einstein for all?
We could call it the NSA agent. You know, it'll just sit there and tell NSA when you get hacked.
Look, I think Pablo is right, but I would put an asterisk on what we mean by American companies, because there's a big difference between a publicly traded big company with money that goes, no fucking, like, we have in-house counsel and there's no way we're letting you in here, government. And then you're like 50-person shop in Alabama that goes, oh, there's something wrong with our database thing. Yeah, whatever. Like, put your thing in there. Like, they don't care.
But here's the thing, Jags, right? Like, go through the presidential policy directive, look at the national critical infrastructure sectors, which be the first ones that get these agents. Point to me those that fill the need as a national, or the definition of national critical infrastructure, that are 50-person shops, right? These are like big transportation hubs, financial hubs, right? Even when you're talking about very small shops like utilities, water treatment plants, they're owned by these huge conglomerates, right? And the margins are razor thin. right? They're never going to voluntarily allow the US government to sit on their networks and monitor the networks. They're just not.
I think they are.
Voluntarily?
So that-
Voluntarily.
that's exactly-
And I think they are precisely because the margins are so razor thin is the reason. I think that is the pro. The con is they don't like the government, or they want to perceive that they're not being monitored by them. But honestly, I don't think they care as much. They're not libertarians. They're here to make money. You know what I'm saying?
I'll give
Like-
you another side of this one, right? Which is, I think, the more realistic thing that will kill this before it even starts. CISA has to have a conversation about vendor favoritism just to post a blog. You think they're going to jump into the IR space in any way when they could be like eating business from Verizon and CrowdStrike and Mandiant and whomever? Like,
I think these issues are workable. I got to be honest. I mean, there's like MITRE does this all day, every day, right? Like, these are, as much as like the U.S. government is like, you know, by law not allowed to compete with, you know, real companies. These issues are workable, I think. So yeah, are they roadblocks? Yeah, a lot. You have to make a list of the roadblocks. And then I think what Pablo's really saying is he's pessimistic about the government being able to accomplish things. Like,
and that's always the right thing to do.
So
I agree with Pablo that the government can never get anything done. Like, I would quote Pablo and agree with him.
Well,
But
you
it's
know,
Pablo's
process.
opinion.
Let me clarify. While I don't disagree with that comment, I did not say that the US government is incapable of getting anything done. What I said was, my experience has been whenever the government has gone to a private company and said, we know these bad things are happening to you, we would like to sit and help defend your network. The answer has roundly been no. And then they've added on, what we really want is we want to be indemnified by the government so that we can hack back.
Yes, and I will say,
That is
relationship
point.
management
Point.
is a hard problem that requires good communication. Things that have not been done in the past. But I also think those things can change.
Okay,
Right,
so
like-
hackback, the spirit of hackback is the same as like, why don't we just arm the teachers? Like a fucking school teacher with a gun will take,
What we
that's
need
what,
is more guns in school. That'll fix it.
that's what hackback is. Like, oh, defend us. No, fuck those dudes. Like, let's go to their house. Like,
Well, like that's the thing is like, what are you gonna do? Like, if you hack back, are you gonna like copy the data back? I mean, like that's not how the internet works, right? Like
I know that.
It's
You
not
try
like
to-
you steal their copy of the data. Like,
Listen, I sat in a war game, right, with national critical infrastructure where they were trying to figure out the whole point of the exercise, and it was run by Jackie Schneider, was to figure out at what point do things get so bad in private industry for national critical infrastructure that they will call the US government and ask for help. And before it started, I looked at Jackie, I said, let me tell you the answer to this. The answer is going to be never, until things have gone so far that there's no possible way to come back. And they want the US government holding the bag when it all goes to hell in a handbasket. And I said, the one possible exception is nuclear power generation. And guess what we found out, right? And so when we had the outbrief, the response from industry was, what we really want is we want the ability to hack back. And I went, great. How many of you, raise your hand. How many of you think that you have the technical schnitz to go up against the CCP? Right? And the silence was deafening. But that's the argument, right? They don't want the US government on their networks. What they want is to be able to respond however they want and be indemnified for it. That's why it's going to fail. It's got nothing to do with, how competent or incompetent the US government is or the talent or anything like that. The reason it's not going to happen is private industry doesn't want it.
I think we should do a separate conversation on that particular piece. I got to be honest.
I want to swing back to something that we've completely skipped over, which is Google finally caught a Chrome ODay and spoke about it. Like they spent a year looking for it from DPRK. Somehow they missed it, and finally they've caught it. And so, golf clap for them. But I think what's really interesting about the report that they had on that was the level of sophistication of the ops that DPRK was running was pretty high. This was not like some, phishing and like, please let us in your network. Like they had like iframes being dropped from like servers that were like custom targeted phish attacks that were being used to like push people. to things that had like their own fucking exploit servers that checked to make sure that they're going over the exact specific individual that was targeted and not like just some random person who was clicking on the link. Like, that's pretty impressive. Like, they have leveled up their game.
Is anyone confused that the North Koreans are good at hacking? The ops they do are sophisticated. It's not confusing to me that they're good at this. Right?
I
Like,
got in trouble for calling the North Korea. Well, I didn't really get in trouble, but a student of mine got upset that I said North Korea was like the short bus of like nation state ops, and I understand why. But I think the sentiment is valid if the expression is terrible, which is to say, yes, we are surprised because they were clowns and they've been at this since at least like earlier in 2008. And what we saw was clowning, and then they were getting better, but then they would still do dumb shit, right? Like Sony Pictures Entertainment was one of the dumbest uses of nation state power. It was a great
I thought it was
I mean,
very good.
how many movies have come out since then that have made fun?
Zero.
I understand that the
I mean, that was pretty
signaling.
effective.
No, I understand that the signaling value was in some way, was right for now. Seth Rogen will come around. The signaling value was right, and I understand that you flexed. And it might look like a win in that sense. For us, it was great in the sense it was the first time the U.S. government decided timely attribution was a valuable thing to do. Amazing, but it's a pretty fucking stupid use of nation state power. It's a stupid use.
Well, like,
I disagree.
What are they worried about? That they're going to get sanctioned? I mean,
Okay, so
what's
I think
the
what you're
downside?
looking at here, though, ties into your CISA stuff, which is that the feedback loop for offensive teams is minute. It's super small. It's super tight. Like, it's like, watching an insect evolve. So like, yeah, it may not be a super cool team 5 years ago, but it doesn't take that long for an offensive team to get good because they have a goal and a metric and they know what works and what doesn't immediately. So
I'm sorry, go ahead, Dave.
no, go ahead, man. I just think, yeah, of course they got good.
So, so a couple things there, right? First of all, yes, practice, right? They've been doing this a long time. They're going to get good. The other half of it, right, and this goes back to the Axelrod paper about timing of cyber conflict is, and we were talking about this ahead of time, if the cheap, cheesy stuff like, word macro viruses still work, where's my incentive to do anything better, right?
The thing I don't like about that, though, is people assume that the teams only have one methodology and tool chain, but most good teams have multiple methodologies and tool chain. So they're doing both, right? Like, I have super elite ODay and I have my phishing, and they're just like in buckets.
People have motivations other than doing the simplest, most efficient thing, right? Like, if you are a good hacker and you are working on a team that's like, no, like, I see this ODay thing that you're writing and we don't need that. Go back to the macros. We need another few macros out of you. That guy's going to quit because he's going to be frustrated and it's not going to be what he wants to do.
No, I say they didn't steal it. What if they didn't steal it from the last operation?
There's a whole like multivariate calculus that goes into this, right? Like, first one is, hey, do I want attribution or do I care about attribution, right? Because there's only so many teams that are going to be able to go out there and write a really good ODay, right? Whereas word macro virus, that thing is everywhere, right? Anybody can use this. The next question is, what effect am I trying to achieve and how hardened is my target? And what messaging do I want to send that target? Do I want them to know that they were, had by a nation state level actor, or do I want them to think that maybe it was a script kiddie, right? So there's a whole lot of things that go in there, but that's different than what you were saying, Brock, about developing the 0 day. Yeah, absolutely. Like, anytime I don't know anybody that goes, oh, you can develop 0 day. Yeah, don't do that. We want more word. You're always going to develop it. The question is, when do I use it? Now you've got the shiny new ODay and you go, well, do I want to use it? Because, if it gets caught, I lose it. And I've invested a bunch of time and money developing this thing.
No, and you build an OPSEC team, and I think
like hacking is a complicated thing with a lot of nuance and elements, but I just wanted to point out, I think that it's not the only motivating element for hackers is, monetary efficiency or things like that. There is like pride in the job that they're doing. Like, having high security, having a clever thing that is able to ID specific targets and ensure that only the right people get the exploit. Stuff like that.
Who are we talking about
You know,
here?
Well, I
surprisingly
thought we were
enough,
talking about North Korea.
But that's my
Right.
point. Like, who the fuck is the grub talking about? Because that's not the North Koreans.
I
That's
think
what
part
they
of
just
what
hasn't been.
That's what they did. That's what's amazing, right? And this is why the thing I was going to say is that it's probably a very, very small, like the thing is you don't need all of your team to be
Where-
that elite. You only need a few of them to develop that, and then the other people can
Guys,
operate. it.
Where
Fine.
did they
Insane.
suddenly find the dude who can write this level of O days and is just sitting
Remember
around
when
and
they
they're
were
trying to
owning
they're-
people with O days for a year?
But that's my point.
What do you
They're
think
not
you-
trying to frustrate the newest guy on the team so that he doesn't leave to Microsoft. Like, they had a whole operation about stealing O days from security researchers. What are the chances they didn't succeed somewhere that we just haven't heard about? I don't think, or that they're buying them off of somebody who's become a little more unscrupulous. Like, I don't think they suddenly found someone in the back of like, oh, dude, like Pyongyang University over here, like knows how to write
Why not,
Chrome O
though?
days.
Why not? And here's the thing.
People already
The
said that if
one-
you've got someone who's interested, they can fucking teach themselves from nothing.
The one
only
falsehood we
need-
have in this community is that there's a mysterious genetic trait, like being the avatar, that like those people can write O days and the other people who live far away can't. And in the
It's
chat,
the
someone pointed out,
midichlorian count. It's what I
It's a
read.
midichlorian
in
count.
How
Kel-
close you are to
Roth's
DC.
book.
As you get further away from DC, you get less able to write O day. It's a
I
Pearl
don't-
Roth's book suggests that the midichlorian count started to spread from the NSA to brown people in South America, and from there it just took over.
to be fair, I'm not going to go into it, but like this is a serious issue in our cyber policy world, is that we don't. So in the chat, someone's pointing out that like Fluffy Bunny, rest in peace, who was one of the best 90s hackers, defaced security focus, has recently passed away. And I thought it was a whole crew of people because he was so prolific. And it turns out he's Burmese, which I also didn't know.
Wait, didn't- no, one of them is Burmese. Has he actually passed?
Yeah, he's passed. According to open source information that we have gathered. But I will say, like, this is a thing, like,
COVID happened.
there's going to be a reckoning, and that reckoning's when the whole world realizes that there's huge strengths in hacking in countries that we do not expect them to come from. And like I have seen this straight up, like you're thinking like, oh, well, Israel, right? Like, but you're not thinking Saudi Arabia. You're thinking Saudi Arabia is dependent on Israeli products. They're not. This is ridiculous to think about these days. They have hackers who can typey with the O day.
But they typey with the O day they bought from the Israelis. Like, it's
No,
not-
they can build their own.
No.
Like,
That
It's
not
not
true.
true. Here, they got educated. They went home. They're making their own.
yes.
All right. All I'm
This-
saying is
that
the shit
proliferation
we were dealing
problem
with was
is
hacking
over.
team Kandiru, NSO. Like, and that's very Saudi, right? Like, we have money, just buy one of each and we'll figure it out, right? But I'm saying it has
but why
hidden
burn your
whatever
own
talent
stuff
is
when
in
you can
there.
just buy it when you can burn the Israelis.
I just
Right?
want to say, add the word also to these phrases, right? Like they bought NSO Group as well as their own team, right? Like all you have to do is add that thought process. They have good hackers.
Yeah,
All these countries do.
I mean,
So,
like
you know, I just want to
Pelroth.
point out, like,
Yeah.
historically, right, brain virus, right, one of the very first viruses, that was Pakistan, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't the US, that wasn't Israel, that wasn't
Look,
Russia.
the Poroth book is wrong, and it's sort of doubled down on a deep
Whoa.
wrongness that has infected the cyber policy community.
Wow. Are you really just gonna say that, Dave?
It might be factually incorrect. However, it
is
speaks to
also
the
strategically
order truth
incorrect.
that is believed.
How could you
By people.
malign a CISA advisor on this call, Dave? How could you?
I will just say, when we make that mistake, when we think that we can build a cyber policy framework that does not include the idea that O days are being built everywhere in the world, we
Yeah.
run into problems.
It's the idea that in order to have high technology, you have to have access to American stuff. That it, in some way, an O day is a lot like having GPS, right? Oh, well, you'd have to be able to like launch your own satellites, there's just all of this ramp that you have to get up before you can even start there. And it's not at all. You need someone who's interested and who's spent a couple of years on a computer, and they can do it. And they can start that when they're 15. They can
Can I
be
circle
running
back to something though? So I think we've done the whole like lapses thing again, where we're talking about O days and who can develop O days. I wish we were at the point in our cybersecurity state where my biggest concern was O days and not 10-year-old exploits and machines that people have forgotten about that are still
And
running.
10-year-olds, and
Polaris.
straight up 10-year-olds.
10-year-olds,
Right.
Yeah.
10-year-olds with 10-year-old exploits.
Like I hope that one day somebody in our field grows up and gets a job and doesn't know what MSO 8067 is. I hope that happens one day. I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. Right.
They might not anymore. The Zoomers are just Metasploit go burr. I don't know that they necessarily know what the exploits
They even
are.
need Metasploit because they already have everyone's password. Like you can just download all of the passwords from everywhere and be done with it. Right. And then it gets called like credential stuffing, as if it's like impressive using a list of like every password that people have thought of. I mean, it's like the problem is that like we have people. And people are still using the same shit that they've been using since forever. And like, it's been accruing as like debt in the public, not just at specific companies. And so, yeah, we're all fucked.
All right, guys, we've been in overtime and we are 15 minutes away from our actual limit. We can keep talking about this, but if you had one topic you would regret leaving this call without covering, and it isn't shitting on CISA or Nicole Perlroth.
I was gonna
or Google Cloud.
Do we like
Chronicle?
Do we like
Chronicle
anyone?
acquisitions. Maybe M&A discussion.
If I could leave this call without getting sued, that would be fantastic.
Career limiting moves.
Yeah. I'm trying to see how many career limiting moves I can hit without,
Yeah. So let's see. We did Viasat.
Bill Demercapi getting fired by Zoom.
No, that shit has been like, that's the sort of thing that happens everywhere. Remember when the Cisco guys got like fired, or that dude that like tried to name his like penetration tool like penis or something stupid like that and got fired at
It was Meat Pistol, and it was a great tool.
Yeah.
It was a play on Metasploit. It's just rearranging the letters.
Right. Sex Pistols is about pistols, not about the sex. Come on, man. Like,
I'm just saying. You've gone corporate, Grug.
Yeah, I have. You found me out.
But here's one thing that we have not talked about, which is the Ukrainian teams that are hacking Russia appear to be having some success. And I don't know if it's real success or not real success. I wish there was a Russian cybersecurity team that was defending Russia that could release reports about that. But
maybe in an antivirus company.
The travel thing seemed real. There was an article about them getting wiped and then having to revert to paper, right? Like this is like all the predictions that people made in academic papers did not account for in a real conflict. Random IT workers are all of a sudden going to be pressed into position, and you're going to have this sort of very, like right now, a lot of people are getting trained up on real ops that have never done them before in Ukraine. I assume. I don't know what's real here and what's not.
So there's a bunch of interesting things happening. One of them is that there's this sort of public IT cyber army thing. And in a lot of ways, that's sort of like, that's not the real threat. Like the real threat is people who are more professional and who are using this as an opportunity to help where they can. But I think sort of what Dave was raising is that of those like 300,000 people in this public army who are, vaguely interested in hacking, some percentage of them are going to actually hack, and some of them are going to be learning how to do like real operations out of this, just from like purely being able to operate, fail, and not go to jail in the process. They can sort of learn, right? They're going to have an opportunity to fail upwards, which is kind of what you need. And what happens when like it's over And you now have like all of these people who just kind of learned these skills for whatever reason.
Well, as someone in the chat says, what happens when one of these random apartment blocks that a Ukrainian hacker is using as their home base gets hit by a missile, right? I mean, I know the Russians are already doing that, but
They're going to do
like,
it anyways.
they're going to, perhaps. I'm just saying is like from a policy perspective, there's so much happening in that space. And we actually are not talking about it, right? Like a lot of these hackers, are they in Ukraine? Are they Ukrainian? Are they Ukrainian, but have been forced to
I'm
become
sorry,
refugees?
there's no cyber war, first and foremost. None of that shit's happening. Second, we'll ignore anything that's going on. Third, no one would ever conscript and distribute a decentralized army invited to just hack. So like, all I'm saying is our concepts from a collective policy perspective have been not just tragically outdated, but straight up wrong. And now shit's happening and everyone has scurried away from their op-eds. And
No. They just claimed they were right all along.
You can't focus on the negative. The good news is all of your cyber Pearl Harbors are safe, right?
No, I'm saying it's all been bullshit, and we're gonna wait until this is over and until there's a post-mortem 5 fucking years from now. Someone's gonna be like, you know, we weren't quite right about that. Like there's a different idea here, right? In some PhD thesis somewhere, and the people that are writing those op-eds are gonna knock them down. Like,
well, so like this is the thing I've been pointing out is that the cyber war continues to be entirely practical as opposed to like spectacular, right? Like people just keep doing things that they think are actually useful as opposed to doing things that like sound scary to policymakers, and that's throwing everyone off. Right? Like they're not taking out the electrical grid. They're posting on like fucking review sites, hey, this is what's happening when, you know, Russia invades Ukraine, because they think informing Russian people is valuable. Like they think that is a useful thing for them to be doing. But one of the issues that I think we sort of touched on is these people are not necessarily operating out of Ukraine. Right, like they're just like the cyber partisans are not operating out of Belarus. So what does it mean to be let's say a NATO country that has a cyber partisan unit operating independently of the government against Russia? Like, where does that put us policy-wise? Because no one's really been talking about like, what does it mean when we just say like, hey, that's normal, that's cool, that's just sort of, that's okay. If you have someone else like hacking in your territory, you know, nothing wrong with that.
well, but it was the same issue you had with the North Koreans operating out of other parts of Asia, right? Or China, like in general. It's always been an issue. I mean, what we are getting to here is, again, how tragically outdated these concepts are, because it doesn't make any fucking sense to talk about national constructs. It doesn't make the same way it never makes sense for the UK to be like, we're going to ban encryption. And you mean, well, you're going to enforce it for companies that aren't within the UK? And like,
so how many companies that are important enough globally that have encryption that anyone cares about? I mean, because they're ensuring that they won't if they do that, but it's not like WhatsApp or Signal are suddenly going to be pulled off the market globally because.
But that's where you get into the real friction, which is you're trying to create local laws for transnational organizations. And there is no reality to international law when it comes to, not with teeth, when it comes to these companies, right? No one here can actually, it turns out, tell Google or Facebook or Microsoft to do anything. The Irish can continue to fund their economy going, oh, you guys did a bad thing. How about you pay us 50 million and we'll be cool with it? And like that, okay, fine. But like you aren't gonna stop them. You're not gonna even make Google change the color of their front page.
Really? Because, you know, I would argue that China's been tremendously successful at getting companies to do things. Right.
I forget China's a part of the real world.
Had a thing where they got into it with Google and Facebook over, making sure that they paid for news aggregation. So I don't think it's fair or correct to say you can't force them to do things. It's just going to take a bit more of a unified front. Now, China can do it easily because they've got a huge market and companies stand to make a tremendous amount of money there, right? But you've seen, Russia with their crypto laws. A lot of, VPN companies went, okay, we're not complying, we're going to leave. But other companies have stood up and went, yeah, we're fine with that, right? We'll fill in the vacuum.
But you're talking about the difference between, like, and I don't let me gloss over your Australia point, because I think that's where you're right and I'm wrong. But when it comes to Russia and China, you're talking about the same totalitarian capability to control things that glosses over pretty much every argument that we've had throughout this whole call, right? The whole IR, we don't trust the government thing doesn't fucking matter in China, right? The whole, like, you can't direct the company to the bathroom or tell them where to store their data doesn't matter in Russia, because you can say, well, then either get the fuck out, or we're arresting your executives, or tomorrow we turn, your local Microsoft chapter over to somebody else who's going to change the first letter, and now we have a local, Microsoft, right? Like, it's just boom. The same as McDonald's.
You've got the Australia thing, you've got GDPR, you've got CCPA, right? Like,
don't you bring
there
GDPR
have been
into this?
inroads, right? Not huge, because frankly, Western governments haven't asked for huge changes yet. But there have been inroads to correcting behavior or altering behavior of these huge, multinational conglomerates.
This is true. Now we have to click like, yes, I accept cookies, which we didn't used to have to do. So,
Every cookie, every time.
I will say, let me just put a spin on that, which is, I think people look at these big companies and they think that they are ungovernable by governments because of an authorities issue, when it's really more about a complexity issue, right? Like, there's a scale problem to government management, right? Like, they can only think about so many things and they can only handle so many issues. And when a company presents that number plus one issue, they become ungovernable in a sense, right? So there's an issue there. But I also think that Russia could be a very weird exploratory space here, because in the past, people have not been able to, like, you can't hack North Korea to change its behavior, right? Like, I know there was that article that came out where people were DOSing random stuff, but like, North Korea didn't care. But Russia's not North Korea. Russia's an industrialized nation, right? Like, and they do rely on their internet structure. They do rely on their computers to handle travel, to handle all, like, their supply chain, their energy dependence, right? Like, what is going to happen when you have called out open warfare against a country that depends on it? It's a new thing. This has not happened in the past, and we don't have the understanding to really play into that world.
I'm not going to say it's never, there have been things that's similar to, like, at one point you can make the argument that the same thing that's happening now with Google and governments happened with, say, the Catholic Church and governments, right? There's some parallels there. I don't want to go down too far. So, but it's not that we've not done this. Listen, multinational banks have been around forever. World governments have figured out how to regulate them. Stock markets, same thing, right? So
I figured out how to find them. I don't know if they figured out how to control.
I didn't say it was
them,
effective regulation, but they, right, like the amount of trainings I have to do per year because of U.S. banking regulations is tremendous.
Well, I mean, that's actually an interesting thing, because prior to like the 20s, the US had like an economy that they just kind of left alone. And then once they started regulating it and using it, they were able to do sanctions. They were able to use the economy as a weapon against other countries. Like, it opened up a new field of state coercion. Like, it used to not be a thing. And then suddenly in like the 30s, it was like, oh shit, we can sanction Japan. Like, should we even do that? Is it right to start using our like economic might to force countries to do things? Like, is that a thing that we should do? Like, it was a debate. And like, that's new. So yeah, like, things do change. And I think it helps when countries realize that they can use it to beat other countries up. Right? Like, that's when they start stepping in and being like, oh, this is a good idea. So we have 2 minutes, and I'm going to take this opportunity to fucking try and close us out before we go for another 30 minutes over.
NordVPN. Please speak about our sponsor.
A huge thank you to Kim Zetter for supporting the channel.
Well, no. Okay. In all seriousness, I've said a lot of incendiary things today, and we've all kind of like had a good time. It's not that the situation is never as bad as we put it. It's just deeply frustrating. And there's a lot of folks, a lot of them in this call, who are probably the shining lights in this whole situation, that we can all still get together and be like, wow, this all sucks and this, that, and the other way. But, people are running into the fire constantly, and it's mostly the people that we all hang out with here and whatnot. So, don't let any of this bullshit get you down. You can still Google dork your way to success. And thanks for showing up. We're going to try to keep doing these weekly, even when Silas is not around. And hopefully it's not that much a shittier experience, but I appreciate it, and don't sue me. And Grug, if you want to.
Silas is the one who has a clock, which is why we went over this time. So,
exactly.
Absolutely. Thanks for showing up in the chat, and we appreciate everyone showing up. Reminder that we do treat these issues with a bunch of levity, but at the same time, Ukraine is going through a humanitarian crisis, and we do encourage you to donate to Red Cross and so on to assist with that. And I remind you, if you're going to do something stupid, don't get caught. So
that's right.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
But if you do, don't get caught.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. We'll try to be back next week. You can't rely on that, but we'll try. So take care, everyone. Go work.
Yeah, and smash like and subscribe.
Visit our sponsors.
Yeah.
Use the Grug to get 20% off NordVPN. Bye, everyone.